This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State Livestock Specialist Joel DeRouchey and K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber as they explain a recent publication on composting livestock mortalities. Tawnie Larson, Project Manager for the Kansas Agriculture Safety and Health Program at K-State, continues today's show discussing ATV and UTV safety. She reminds listeners of important safety measures. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show by saying Kansas remained 17th in the nation in milk production and ranked 16th in production per cow. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about composting livestock mortalities with K-State Livestock Specialist Joel DeRouchey and K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber. Joel, Ron, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So composting livestock mortalities is one option, and why might this be something that people want to do if they have unfortunately lost livestock?
In Kansas, there's really three options for dealing with mortalities, livestock mortalities. We all hope that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, if you raise livestock and you do it long enough, it will happen. And so there's kind of three options. One is burial. Another one is calling the local renderer. And then a third is composting. And sometimes because of where you live and situations, composting may be the only option. If you have a mature cow herd, renderers won't pick them up, and renderers are getting fewer and farther between, and it's difficult. In some areas, they're not even available, and so sometimes we can cross that option off pretty quick. Burial can be an option depending on where you're located, but depending on environmental conditions and primarily depth to groundwater and whether or not you might be in a sensitive groundwater area. If you are in one of those situations, then burial is not an option either. And so at that point, composting is your only option.
And so for people who have chosen composting, whether actually an option or is just the only choice available, site selection, something that's really important, and what are some factors with that?
Even if we're composting in a sensitive groundwater area, we have to pay attention to how far down it is to that groundwater. And in many cases, we've got to have either a concrete pad to utilize for that site, or we have to have a compacted clay liner, really very similar to what we would put in the bottom of a lagoon or a wastewater storage pond. And so we're looking at maybe having 12 inches of compacted clay. And the idea is to prevent a barrier so that any seepage doesn't end up in our groundwater and doesn't contaminate it. Another very important consideration is locating somewhere that's away from any surface water body. So if we have a stream or river or something that maybe is close to our farmstead, we certainly don't want to put the composting site right next to that intermittent stream or that perennial stream. So, the idea again is to protect surface water quality and make sure that anything that might leach away from that composting site doesn't end up in our surface water. So the location, one, looking at groundwater, and then two, making sure that we're away from any of those surface water drainages where it might end up there fairly quickly. And certainly there's some things that we recommend doing around those composting sites, and we want to see a grass buffer around that, kind of, somewhat similar to what we sometimes do below confined feeding operations. We would do the same thing around a composting site so that anything that might come off of there is certainly filtered before it gets very far away. And those are the primary concerns from a water standpoint. We don't typically think too much about the air quality too much, because if we're managing the site properly, there shouldn't be any air quality issues. But I always help people to be very cognizant of where their neighbors are at. And, we don't want to locate a composting site right across the road from maybe where the neighbors are at. So we need to have them a little more secluded on the site so that they're, the old saying, out of sight, out of mind, really pertains here.
And really to continue with Ron's thoughts, I mean, really the composting of mortalities, that's been going on for many, many decades, right? So it just really depends. In the swine species in particular, this has been very routine. In fact, most swine operations have on-site composting to handle mortalities, and they've really done that for one, as an effective disposal method, but also from a biosecurity standpoint of not having rendering come onto their farm. And also, as Ron mentioned, rendering is very scarce in many locations. And so while this may be a newer or non-used method for some producers, many producers across not only Kansas, but the entire U.S. utilize this as a means for really all species, and it really just depends on their size and scope and maybe what their historical needs were for disposing of these mortalities.
What are some key things when it comes to designing a site then?
Ron's talked a little bit about the environmental side. I would say, both from whether that's on a concrete or a heavy clay-packed area, you're going to want to have some drainage so that the water doesn't drain into the compost site, while we don't want any leachate to run off. And again, Ron talked about having a grass filter strip and things surrounding that to help buffer that. But we do want to have some moderate drainage so water doesn't pool. So when we have mortalities and we've been in a high moisture time, that site is not just mucky mud that we can get in and get those animals prepared and put into that compost area. And again, the compost area, you can use everything from round bales in between them. We like to try and develop almost some bays. While we can just have a single pile that they're added to off to the sides, or in our smaller animals, we can certainly go up in terms of we start with some animals and we can build on top of them for the next layer of mortalities. We're still going to want to have, ideally, some bays, and those could be the concrete blocks. A lot of people will use even just hay bales, something to separate so we can distinctly have those. And so when we have those after about a 2 to 3 month period, we can get in with a front end loader, turn that pile, and we'll talk next, I think, about maybe some of the temperature and conditions that we need. But we want to set that up that we can get our equipment in relatively easily, both to turn the pile and to build the pile with both the carbon sources and mortalities. And so we need to have good road access or a strong subsoil of something packed that we can get that equipment in and out of relatively easy, regardless of environmental conditions.
What else does need added to a composting pile or done with a composting pile for it to be appropriate and correct?
That's one of the questions when I work with livestock producers. They always want to know, well, what can I use for material to encase that mortality? And sometimes they want to use manure. Well, that's not a good idea. We need a high carbon source. So, what I recommend is maybe straw, some used hay, even scraping up some of the used hay from a round bale feeder that, now we're not talking about scraping up the manure too, but some of that hay that might be on the surface will work really good. If the producer feeds silage, a silage materials will work really well too. And so those are the most common ones. Certainly we can use like wood chips and some of that kind of stuff too, but that's not something that, that farmers typically have on hand. So most of the time we're looking at just, straw, old hay, silage, that kind of thing. And, we want a good base layer of that on the bottom. A good 18 inches, 24 inches, then lay the animal on top. And then, again, we want to completely encase that animal in that carbon material. And, and part of that is to help discourage predators from getting into it. But certainly we need the right kind of ratio of the nitrogen from the dead animal and then the carbon source to kind of make that work.
Really what that allows then is that pile, what you want is heating. So when we have that animal that's the muscle and body tissue or nitrogen, we interlay that with the carbon of our straw, hay, whatever source, silage that Ron talked about, we'll start to get heating. So what's really important in compost piles is that we try and raise, once we have that mix, that temperature will raise up. And particularly becomes important getting it over 131 degrees for multiple days. That'll kill a lot of pathogens, a lot of bacteria, viruses that may be associated with why that animal died. But ideally, that temperature even rises further than that, up to about 150 degrees. That allows that tissue of that animal to start really breaking down. We also have pretty hard bones in all these animals, and the older an animal is, the more mature, the harder those bones are, particularly in the hip bones, the leg bones, and the skulls. Can be really difficult to get fully composted. So we want to make sure we have some heating. We also need to introduce some moisture. So along with that straw that comes in, if it's uncovered and we have rain events, that's a good thing. If it's really dry conditions, we probably need to be introducing some water on top of that about once a month at least, if it's been no rainfall whatsoever, because we need to have some moisture into that pile to help with that composting and the bugs that kind of help provide that composting experience.
It's also important to keep in mind that livestock mortality composting sites are regulated by Kansas Department of Health and Environment. So if a producer is considering maybe putting in a composting site and thinking about that, it's really important that they contact their local KDHE office and find out about the regulations, because they are regulated through Kansas Department of Health and Environment.
And this is a new publication from K-State Research and Extension. So if people want to find it, how can they do that?
Yeah, it's available on our website. All the different K-State websites are our bookstore. And the publication number specifically is MF2729. That's MF2729. The name of the publication is Environmental Considerations for Composting Livestock Mortalities, and that's available through all the different outlets at our K-State Research and Extension sites.
That was K-State Livestock Specialist Joel DeRouchey and K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber. I will link this publication in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to Bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about ATVs and UTVs with Project Manager for the Kansas Agriculture Safety and Health Program at K-State, Tawnie Larson. Tawnie, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
Tawnie, why are we talking about ATVs, UTVs today?
Well, as the weather warms up, we're going to see more people out across Kansas, both for work and recreation. So these ATVs and UTVs are great vehicles, and they're essential tools for farms and ranches, but they do pose a significant risk if they're not used properly. So at this time of year, when everybody's kind of dusting them off and getting them out, I think it's a really good time to remind everybody about some safety things.
As we're thinking about these all-terrain vehicles and utility task vehicles, what are some stats around them?
So the stats are kind of surprising. There are a lot of injuries and even fatalities, and I think we can avoid a lot of those with some awareness and some safety procedures. So about 100,000 people are treated annually for ATV and UTV injuries nationwide, and about 10,000 are hospitalized each year, and there's even about 600 people that are fatally injured in ATV and UTV accidents.
What are some Kansas-specific stats?
So in Kansas, we have a great resource called Ag Injury News, and they pull data from news articles across the state and across the country. And so in Kansas, they have shown that we have at least 10 people have died in ATV and UTV accidents in our state. And most of those are involving ATVs. And the majority of the fatalities involve men between the ages of 55 and 83 using ATVs for work. And so I think there is space here to talk about what we can do to be safer when we're out there working or recreating.
Are there also concerns then when we're thinking about recreational use, specifically maybe thinking about children?
Absolutely. So children don't always have the cognitive ability to make a correction at the last moment. And ATVs are really agile and they're fast and kind of unforgiving. And so it does make sense that even though like the minimum age to operate an ATV is 16, but that doesn't mean that they're tall enough, that they can reach the pedals and all the controls, and also that they're mature enough for the complex decisions that have to be made.
Are there any stats that go along with that?
Overall, in the U.S., the injury toll for children under the age of 16 is 40,000 usually end up in the emergency room. And they're usually ATV related over UTVs. And also there's around 130 ATV related fatalities among children each year. So that number is too high. So we need to do what we can to reduce that number.
And specifically looking at just UTVs right now, what are a few general safety thoughts for listeners?
So UTVs are generally considered safer than ATVs due to their design. UTVs usually have the roll bars, they have the seat belts, sometimes speed governors, especially if you don't have a seatbelt on, it doesn't let you go very fast. And they're also heavier, larger, and they usually are just operated at lower speeds than an ATV. And so they're great for work and transporting tools and feed and even calves sometimes. So it is good to note that there is a difference between UTVs and ATVs as far as what their use is and then also how they operate.
What are some safety measures you would really appreciate if people followed when it comes to UTVs?
So I like to say that never allow human passengers in the cargo area of the UTVs. I know people that do this all the time. What to remember most is that there's nothing strapping people down. So if you go over a big bump or you get into a gully or something, it's very possible that you can be knocked out and end up on the ground. And, the injury can happen that way. And also, while people are riding inside the either driving or passenger, to wear their seatbelts. I know that we do that, and it really has made a difference in, you don't get bounced around as much. You probably feel a little bit better. If you're out there all day working and getting bounced around, then you will not move as much if you have a seatbelt on. And so you might not have that fatigue at the end of the day. And then, of course, staying within the speed limits and operating with caution, planning your routes carefully, too. So most people probably know what's in their pasture, and so they know what to avoid. I think we come into problems when we have new washouts or there's some rocks that have appeared that they didn't know were there before, or maybe somebody's driving it that is not as familiar with the path that's being taken.
What are some reminders when it comes to operating ATVs?
So ATVs are used widely for recreational work and agricultural work. And so checking livestock, spraying weeds, that type of thing come in really handy. And it really is a tool that most people use on their farm or their ranch. And ATVs are usually involved in more crashes than UTVs, and most fatalities are usually linked to ATVs as well. And so usually it's because of excess speed or inattentive driving. And some of the common hazards of operating an ATV is underage operators. And so, as we mentioned before, sometimes they are not cognitively ready to operate a machine that is so large and heavy and goes fast. And so we have to think about how to keep them safe when they're out, probably recreating more than anything. And also, if they are out, say, jumping terraces, I hear that is like super fun to do. But that is also where they could possibly roll or flip an ATV. So I think supervision makes a difference there as well when we're talking about some underage operators. And extra passengers are also a big thing with ATV users. And so 1/3 of the injuries involve passengers, as most ATVs are designed for just one operator. And then the rough terrain and obstacles is also an issue. And rollovers happen quite often on ATVs. And usually they flip back or flip over. And something to keep in mind, too, is that ATVs are not designed for highway use. In some states, they are legal to be on the highway, but that doesn't mean that the tires are correct and the speed would be appropriate to be on a highway.
And as we're thinking about ATVs, and you mentioned that they're commonly more involved in crashes than UTVs, what are some safety measures that are recommended for people operating ATVs?
So ATV safety is similar to motorcycle safety as well. And a lot of the protective gear could be the same. And so wearing a helmet that is Department of Transportation approved. So you could probably pick those up pretty inexpensively, around $50. And so they don't have to be super, super expensive, but they definitely make a difference. Same with eye protection, safety goggles or glasses. Sunglasses are not significant enough to cover and protect the eyes, but maybe with goggles over it, they would be okay. And then long sleeve pants and shirts make a big difference. If you've ever had road rash, it's really nice if you've had long pants or long sleeves on, as well as proper footwear. So sturdy boots, no sandals, flip-flops, Crocs, that kind of thing. You want to have on something that would protect your feet if you do end up in a crash.
Is there appropriate fit or proper fit when it comes to ATV fit and training?
Yes. So most people don't realize that ATVs come in all different sizes. And so it's important to size the ATV for the rider, whether that's an adult or a child or a teenager. And so it's really important that the children can have the strength and the skill to reach all the controls, be able to make a decision, and put it in action before they have a crash. But a lot of that has to do with the fit. So I would recommend that people go to a dealer if they're thinking about getting an ATV for their child and have them fit for it. Make sure that it is the right fit. And, also consider, does it allow extra riders or not? Is that something you want your kids to do or not? And so that makes a big difference in the long run.
For anyone thinking about operating an ATV, important for just a few safety measurements of how maybe they should operate the vehicle while they're on it.
ATVs, as I mentioned earlier, are similar to motorcycles. And so understanding body movement, when do you lean with the turn and when do you shift forward, such as climbing a hill or backwards when descending, make a big difference. And so body awareness is huge. It's just like riding a bicycle. You have to know what the machine under you is doing and what your body is doing. And we've all had trial and error probably in that field. Also taking a training class, learn the proper handling techniques, learn the laws, learn how to ride in different terrains and what equipment to use. And proper equipment fitting does make a big difference too.
Tawnie, what are a few key points that you'd really like our listeners to remember as we're thinking about ATV and UTV safety?
So for the parents, grandparents, friends, community members, everybody out there, safety starts with education and setting a good example. And so if you have your kids or grandkids riding and you want them to ride safely, then you need to also practice safe riding, especially when they're around. But teach them how to ride an ATV and UTV. Don't just think that they know how to do it. And observe them as they are riding, maybe have them ride around in a small area, and you can then teach them and correct them while they're right there in front of you rather than later on when they've hit a hazard or something. So we want them to be safe all the way around before they get out there and start driving.
Tawnie, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Project Manager for the Kansas Agriculture, Safety, and Health Program at K-State, Tawnie Larson. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. 2024 milk production was down compared to 2023. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that Kansas remains 17th in the nation in terms of milk production.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning where we ended up in 2024 in terms of milk production. Numbers have been totaled and some information has recently come out from our Milk Marketing Administrator's Office, and looks like across the United States in 2024, milk production was actually down compared to 2023. And as you look over the last 10 years, 8 of those years we actually had record production and increase each year, but the last 2 years, 23 and 24, we've actually seen a production decrease. However, over the past 5 years, if you look at 2024 compared to 2019, we actually had a gain of about 3.4% in total milk production. So in the 2024 numbers, 18 of the states across the United States saw an increase in milk production during that time, and 28 states actually posted production losses So our production increases did not outweigh production losses across the United States. In terms of total milk production, Kansas remains ranked at 17th in the nation, which is the same ranking that we had in 2023. As we look at what the trend has been over the last 5 years, it's interesting that 16 states recorded production increases during that same time, and 32 states recorded production decreases in the last 5 years. So Kansas is one of those states still posting production increases each year, but majority of states have, over the last 5 years, have actually seen a decrease in production. One of the numbers we often look at in the dairy industry is the per capita milk production by state, and basically that takes the total milk production in the state and it divides it by the number of people living in the state. Here in Kansas, we produce about 1,423 pounds per capita in 2024. It takes about 600 pounds per capita to meet the dairy needs of an individual. So we're a net exporting state. As we look at the states to the south and east of us, the trends continue that these states are very milk deficit when looking at milk production per capita. So we have increased marketing opportunities in that region. As we look at changes in per capita milk production over the last 5 years, again, comparing 2024 to 2019, Kansas has had a net increase of about 8 pounds per capita during that time. Again, many of the states to our south and east have had significant losses in per capita production and allows us to continue to ship milk into those regions to meet those regional needs. As we look at average milk production increases, Kansas over the last 5 years ranks number 7 in production increases, just a little over 10% increase in production over those last 5 years, which is good for a growing state. We expect this trend will continue as we move into 2025 and 2026 due to some of the increases that we see in farms and farm size due to the new plant out in Dodge City. As we look at per capita increases, Kansas ranks 6th in that category at just a little under 10% increase in per capita production over the last 5 years as we compare 24 back to 19. As we look at production per cow, this is another area where Kansas continues to gain. Over the past 5 years, our production per cow has increased a couple of percent. We currently rank 16th in production per cow across the United States, somewhat lower than a couple of our neighbors, Colorado ranking number 4 and Nebraska ranking number 9, but much ahead of Missouri at 44 and Arkansas at 46. So all in all, 2024 was a good year for milk production here in Kansas. We continue to grow in terms of total milk production as well as production per cow. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.